The morning sun cast golden light across the dusty plains of Cedar Creek Ranch as Harold Mercer stepped onto his weathered porch. At 62 years old, he had spent the last decade alone on this land, speaking only when necessary and avoiding the townsfolk who remembered him as something other than the grumpy old rancher he had become. His wife Martha had passed away 10 years ago, and their only son had moved to the city, rarely calling and never visiting. Harold had convinced himself that solitude was exactly what he deserved and precisely what he wanted. On this particular Tuesday, Pastor Williams drove up the long dirt road in his old pickup truck. Harold watched with narrowed eyes as the vehicle came to a stop near the barn. "Whatever you're selling, I ain't buying," Harold called out before the pastor could even close his door. Pastor Williams stepped out slowly, his kind face showing no offense at the gruff greeting. "Good morning to you too, Harold. I'm not here to sell anything. I'm here to ask for your help." Harold snorted. "My help? You got the wrong ranch." The pastor walked closer, and that's when Harold noticed the small figure sitting quietly in the passenger seat of the truck. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with tangled brown hair and eyes that seemed far too serious for such a young face. "This is Emma," Pastor Williams said. "Her grandmother passed away last month. She was the only family Emma had left. We've been trying to find a foster placement, but the nearest family services office is backed up for weeks. I've asked everyone in town, Harold. No one can take her, even temporarily." Harold felt his jaw tighten. "And you thought the meanest man in 3 counties would be a good choice for watching a child? Have you lost your mind?" "I think you're a man who knows what loss feels like," the pastor replied gently, "and I think beneath all that gruffness, you still have the same good heart Martha always talked about." The mention of his wife's name made Harold wince. He opened his mouth to refuse, to send them away, to return to his comfortable loneliness. But then Emma opened the truck door and stepped out, clutching a small backpack that clearly held everything she owned in the world. And she looked up at him with those serious eyes and said nothing. She didn't plead or cry or try to win him over with charm. She simply stood there, waiting for yet another adult to decide her fate. Something cracked inside Harold's chest. 2 weeks, he heard himself say, not a day more. The first 3 days were awkward and silent. Emma stayed in the small guest room that hadn't been touched since Martha decorated it years ago. She ate what Harold cooked without complaint, washed her own dishes, and spent hours sitting on the porch, watching the horses in the distant pasture. Harold found himself watching her too, wondering what thoughts occupied such a quiet child. On the 4th morning, Harold woke to find Emma already awake, standing at the kitchen window with her nose pressed against the glass. She was watching Dusty, the old chestnut mare who had been Martha's favorite horse. "You like horses?" Harold asked, pouring himself coffee. Emma nodded without turning around. "You ever ridden one?" She shook her head. Harold surprised himself again. "Well, come on then. Dusty's gentle as they come. She could use some attention anyway." That morning changed everything. As Harold lifted Emma onto Dusty's broad back, the little girl smiled for the first time since arriving. It was a small smile, hesitant and fragile, but it lit up her whole face. "She's warm," Emma said softly, patting Dusty's neck. "That she is," Harold replied. And he felt something warm spreading in his own chest, too. The days began to take on a new rhythm. Harold taught Emma how to brush the horses, how to check their hooves, how to mix their feed. She followed him around the ranch, asking questions in her quiet voice, absorbing everything like a little sponge. In the evenings, Harold found himself pulling out old photo albums he hadn't touched in years. He showed Emma pictures of Martha, of his son, as a young boy, of the ranch in its prime, when cattle had filled the pastures. "She was pretty," Emma said, pointing to Martha's smiling face. "The prettiest woman I ever knew," Harold agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "And the kindest. She would have loved you." Emma looked up at him with those serious eyes. "My grandma was kind too. She made me pancakes every Sunday." "Every Sunday, huh?" Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Well, tomorrow is Sunday." The pancakes weren't perfect. Harold hadn't made them in years, and he burned the first batch completely. But Emma helped him with the second attempt, standing on a chair to pour the batter while Harold supervised. They ate those slightly lumpy pancakes together, and Harold couldn't remember a meal tasting better. And Harold couldn't remember a meal tasting better. As the 2 weeks drew closer to their end, Harold found himself dreading the pastor's return. The ranch, which had felt like a prison of loneliness for so long, had become something else entirely. Emma's quiet presence had filled spaces he didn't even know were empty. She had begun leaving little drawings on his coffee table, pictures of horses, of the ranch house, of a tall, grumpy-looking man standing next to a small girl with brown hair. Each drawing made Harold's heart ache in a way that was both painful and precious. One night, a thunderstorm rolled across the plains. Harold heard small footsteps in the hallway and found Emma standing outside his bedroom door, her face pale with fear. "The thunder," she whispered. "It sounds like the world is breaking." Harold didn't hesitate. He scooped her up and carried her to the living room, where he wrapped her in Martha's old quilt and sat beside her on the worn couch. He told her stories about the ranch, about the animals, about nothing important at all, until the storm passed and she fell asleep against his shoulder. Looking down at her peaceful face, Harold felt tears on his cheeks for the first time in 10 years. When Pastor Williams returned 2 weeks later, Harold met him at the porch, with Emma standing beside him, her small hand holding 2 of his calloused fingers. "I need to talk to you about the foster care process," Harold said before the pastor could speak. "Oh, whatever paperwork needs filling out, whatever home inspections need doing. I want to start today if possible." Harold paused, his voice cracking slightly. "If she'll have me, that is." He looked down at Emma, suddenly uncertain. Maybe she wanted a real family, younger parents, a mother who could braid her hair and teach her things he couldn't. Emma looked up at him with those serious eyes that weren't quite so serious anymore. "Can we make pancakes again tomorrow? It's Sunday." Harold laughed, a rusty sound that surprised even him. "Every Sunday, little one, every single Sunday." Pastor Williams wiped his own eyes and smiled. "I'll start the paperwork this afternoon." As the pastor's truck disappeared down the dusty road, Harold and Emma stood together on the porch, watching the horses graze in the golden afternoon light. The ranch looked exactly the same as it had 2 weeks ago. But everything had changed. Harold Mercer had spent 10 years building walls around his heart, convinced that love only led to loss. But one quiet toddle girl with serious eyes had found a door he'd forgotten existed and walked right through it. And for the first time in a decade, Cedar Creek Ranch felt like home again.